I would like to invite questions for the panelists. I think we have two attendees who have got questions. Can I ask Emmanuel Esper to come forward with a question, please? I think this is a live question.
Okay, so thank you very much for all this information. I have a question. So my question is, what are your prospects for resolving the Sri Lankan economic crisis? Thank you.
Okay, the question is, what are the prospects of resolving economic crisis in Sri Lanka? Anybody want to take that on, or any of the panelists?
Yeah,
I
wouldn't mind having a go at that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist and a former diplomat, but I'm very acutely sensitive to the conflict implications of certain economic packages and processes as distinct from others. I was, back in the day, I was Director of Conflict Studies at the Institute of Policy Studies, a reputed quasi-governmental think tank in Colombo. So I watched the second insurrection of the late 80s and the human rights consequences from the point of view of policy. Now, it seems to me that Sri Lanka is making, or Sri Lankan rulers are making the same mistakes today as many countries have made before and then gone into cycles of upheaval. One is the lack of transparency concerning the economic reform and recovery package that the government is contemplating. Related to that is the second point, the lack of consensus. And the third is the lack of public consent. Now you have, as I said before in the program, for the first time, a president who has not been directly elected, as our constitution makes for, or even found his place in parliament through election to parliament. Now, it's okay if that kind of presidency is a stopgap presidency, low profile, low key, and then elections are held as soon as possible. But that's not the way that President Wickremesinghe sees himself. He has a very ambitious economic program, which he has signaled in an interview given to The Economist, London. And the interviewer himself or herself says, you seem to be talking about more than just the solution to the present crisis. Now, the reason he said that is that President Wickremesinghe has what we know of as a neoliberal economic philosophy, and he has had for a very long time a certain set of what he thinks are solutions to the economic problems of Sri Lanka. Now, every time he's run for president, he's lost an election, and every time he's been elected prime minister, the people haven't elected him, again for 15 years, and the last time he and his party were wiped out of parliament. Now, if you put in place a socially polarizing program of economic shock therapy without transparency, without consultation, without seeking consensus, without obtaining the consent of the people, then in a country in which we have just had one mass uprising, you are paving the way for a cycle of civic conflict, which of course the government may hope to suppress through the use of the PTA and the deployment of the military. But that is not going to help the economy. So I would say a preliminary step for successful escape from the economic crisis is to adopt the right attitude and the right process. In concrete terms, I would say there has to be an economic roundtable conference summoned by the president, inviting all political parties represented in parliament. And I would also like major trade unions and civil rights and civic organizations, social movements represented. But at the very least, all parliamentary parties which can discuss the crisis and arrive at a consensual package, which may fall short of the radical right-wing reforms that the president has in mind, but will be more sustainable and more deliverable with far less disequilibria and social upheaval. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jatilaka. In a sense, what appeared to be the solution for the question the questioner asked was that the answer to the economic problem in Sri Lanka is not purely dependent on economic relief. It is dependent on the holistic approach towards addressing the problem from the political, socio-economical, as well as the relationship building towards the international community. And that has to come as a package, as an inclusive package with all political parties and larger role players. Thank you for that thought. Our next questioner is, let's just get the name, Mabel Kirani. Hello, Kirani, are you there?
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering whether there has ever been a case that was fully resolved successfully against abuse of the PTA.
Sorry, do you mean that with the use of the PTA resolving the cases, or is that resolving a case which was abused by the PTA?
Resolving a case emerging from abuse of the PTA, for example, the arrest of an innocent person.
Sure.
Now
Okay.
brought to court, has there ever been a successful arbitration against them?
Okay, thank you.
Against
any
the
other panelists
government
wanna
and
take
against
it
the
on?
act.
Any panelists? Maybe Mr. Alagaratnam, would you be able to give us some insight into this? Sorry, we can't hear you. You would have to unmute.
I'm sorry that I was on mute. As far as I can remember, I can recall there have been cases on the unlawful use of, or rather the use of torture to extract confessions, and there were situations where they have been released for violation of torture, so, and successfully challenged the confession that was used as being extracted by torture. That was in some cases from the north and the east during the period of the civil war, the secession that can be, there was certain amount of activity on the part of the judiciary. So there was no condemnation of the PTA as such, but definitely there was relief granted for violation of fundamental rights through a person's wrongful incarceration or conviction on the basis of torture. There have been, not many.
Yeah. Let me also, if I can butt in,
Sure,
to
Go
add
ahead.
some points to what Jeff said. Now, let me point out this case where there was an order made by the Court of Appeal, particularly on a bail application. This relates to the case of Shani Abesekara, one of our senior police officers who was wrongfully detained for several months, and now he's out on bail. Now, in delivering the order of bail, the justices of the Court of Appeal, two are the prominent judges, one of whom has already ascended the Supreme Court now, Justice Janaki Silva and Justice Karna Ratna. They made a scathing attack on the police department, that is his own colleagues, Mr. Shani Abesekara's own colleagues, fabricated evidence. They said they fabricated evidence in order to keep him detained, right? And there was a serious rap on the knuckles of the police department and the officers for having treated their own fellow officer by such means. You know, adding to what Jeff earlier said about this whole PTA causing inefficiency in the investigation matters of the police. So this has contributed to serious inefficiencies because 30 years or more of continued rule under emergency has contributed to virtually making the police department impotent when it comes to proper investigative techniques. They resort to short-term measures like using torture and all these means. So actually, conviction for torture, though we have a convention against torture that has been already embodied in our local legislation. If you see the amount of convictions, not even 1% have been convicted. So this is a sorry state of affairs. Though we have legislation to deal with it, because this has already caused a serious impact on the efficiency of the police department and its proper methods of interrogation and investigations.
Absolutely, Mr. Hakim. Thank you. That is, in a sense, the problem are twofold, isn't it? One problem is the actually proper act, the definition of the act itself, and number two is the misuse of the act to an extent that it is shielded from inside, so that no parties, no even judiciary can dig into it, because you got political polarization of the law. Thank you. We got one more questioner. Polly, please.
Hello. So my question is that the Sri Lankan government in the past, they promised in Geneva human rights community that they will abolish PTA, but they still didn't. So why is that?
Yeah, let me say about this. There was a promise given at least to have a moratorium on the PTA. Now, promise was given on the floor of the House by no less the person as the Prime Minister himself, but then that has already been violated. Now, as Dr. Jayatilaka says, now we have entered a new phase of abusing the PTA against peaceful protesters. So it's a long history of giving promises and violating them. And so now, interestingly, this particular session of the UN Human Rights Council embodies a new stricture that is sought to be introduced by the sponsoring countries. That is to have economic crimes gone into, and to have proper, robust legislation to tackle stolen assets. But they are drawing a connection between the culture of impunity and the abuse of the PTA in order to cover up their economic crimes. And that's a very important area that has now been introduced. And interestingly, and not surprisingly, the Honorable Foreign Minister dismissed this idea and then said that they can't agree with it, doesn't go with the original tenor of the, or rather the mandate of the UN Human Rights Council. But besides that, I must say it's a very important aspect which needs to be focused on.
Thank you. I'm just going to take one more question from Facebook. It is from Louis Keane. He's asking, in a developing world, when most of the political gain are through economic benefits, how do you ensure a new government will not walk down the same path of implementing PTA? Dr. Jayatilaka, would you be willing to answer that?
Yes, I'd like to.
Thank you.
Well, I trust the social dynamics, the social movements that arise from time to time in the history of any country. It is not simply cyclical, or it's not that one government is like another government and like another government. There are times when there are exceptional situations, exceptional phenomena. There could be wars, which are not a good thing in general. There could be popular movements, uprisings, and these real social phenomena have an impact on an election and the ethos of the country after that. The parliament that comes in is influenced by the social mood outside. Now, what we have had in the Aragalaya is quite significant because even credentialed Indian analysts like Colonel Hariharan, who was head of intelligence of the Indian peacekeeping forces in Sri Lanka in 87-90, has written that the Sri Lankan Aragalaya is the first time that a largely peaceful people's movement has overthrown a leader of a South Asian country. So I would expect the composition of the next government and the mindset of the next government to be influenced by the composition of parliament, which in turn would have been influenced by and reflective of the social mood and the power of the public protest movements. I expect it to be a progressive consciousness. Anybody who saw the 100 days of the Aragalaya would know that there was something new and very positive about it. And I think there's been a much clear commitment to ideas of equality, of justice, of democracy on the part of this generation of Sri Lankans than for a very long time. And you see that in the report of the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who was not merely or not only the two-time elected president of Chile, but whose father, a senior military officer, was murdered under torture by the Pinochet dictatorship. And she herself and her mother were political prisoners. She was a leader of the Socialist Party of Chile that fought against the dictatorship. So I think that consciousness is coming to her report. And for the first time, it is on Michelle Bachelet's watch that the report on Sri Lanka of UN Human Rights High Commissioner has taken the totality into account, not merely the war or the northern and eastern parts of the island, but the island as a whole, and the democratic movement, the struggle against repression. Now, she explicitly talks about these protest movements. She explicitly calls upon government dialogue with the protest movements. She explicitly opposes the use of the PTA and the military to suppress it. On the other hand, you see, almost as a counterpart, not a contradiction, representative of the Aragalaya in Geneva addressing the council as NGOs. And for the first time, in my experience with the council, not only as ambassador, permanent representative, but also as a close observer after that. And when I was ambassador, I was elected the vice president of the council. For the first time, I have seen concerning Sri Lanka this kind of dynamic, this interaction and this convergence of the High Commissioner's report and the values of that and the values of the movement. So there's a kind of a docking, a convergence, which I see as very healthy. And I see that interface as what would produce a new charter for human rights and for governance in Sri Lanka as soon as we can get an election, because elections are scheduled quite late in the day, 2.5 years from now. But the social crisis is such, and the anomaly of having an unelected leader is such that we desperately need early elections to the presidency and the parliament. And the sooner we get that election, those elections. But anyway, whenever the elections are held, you're going to have a very progressive, rights conscious parliament, and therefore both a government and an opposition. I believe that.
Thank you, Dr. Jayatilaka. Yes, very, very well answered. I think it is important to understand it's the mood of the public which is going to set the election results. However, there is a history of moods being changed closer to elections, so it is very, very important as the public as well as the human rights activists, the social welfare activists do keep that mood at pace in terms of fairness and the rule of law amongst the whole population. I'm going to take one more question. This is from Lakshani. Do you want to come forward?
Yes. So I'm Lakshani Pereira from Germany and also representing the organization, the International Voice of Sri Lankan Citizens.
Okay.
And I would like to connect a protester from the Aragale movement, an activist who've been at the Gulf Race since the first day. So he would like to question and also express some ideas, but he would speak in Sinhala.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We can try to translate. Yeah.
Tumula, you can take over.
සමාවෙන්න මම මගේ අදහස හරියටම කියන්න ඕන හින්දා තමයි සිංහලෙන් කතා කරන්නේ. ලක්ෂානි මේක ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේට් කරයි. පළවෙනිම දේ තමයි දැන් ඒකට අමතරව දැන් ඊළඟට මේක අහෝසි වෙන තැනදී ඊළඟට රජය ගේන අලුත්ම නීතිය මොන වගේ වෙයිද? දැන් අපිට තියෙන ලොකුම බය ඒක. සමහර වෙලාවට ඒක රස්තවාදයේ වැළැක්වීමේ පනතක් නොවුනත් ඊට වඩා මහ ජනතාව වැළැක්වීමේ පනතක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒක නවත්තන්න පුළුවන් මොනවද UNHRC එකට මේ වෙලාවේ කරන්න පුළුවන්? ප්‍රශ්න අංක 1. ලක්ෂානි එක ට්‍රාන්ස්ලේට් කරන්න මම දෙවෙනි ප්‍රශ්නය අහන්න.
පොඩ්ඩක් ආයෙත් රිපීට් කරන්න පුළුවන්ද? සෝරි.
මෙහෙමයි පළවෙනි ප්‍රශ්නේ දැන් රස්තවාදයේ වැළැක්වීමේ පනත අහෝසි වෙනව නම් ඊළඟට පනතක් ගේනවනේ වෙනුවට ඒ ගේන පනත මේ රජය මොනතරම් දරුණු විදියට ගෙනෙයිද? ඒක සාමාන්‍ය ජනතාව වැළැක්වීමේ පනතක් නොවේ කියෙයිද? ඒකට දෙන්න පුළුවන් ජාත්‍යන්තර මැදිහත් වීම මොන වගේ තත්ත්වයක තියෙනවද? මොන තරමට කෙරෙනවද? මොකද ත්‍රස්තවාදයේ වැළැක්වීමේ පනතකින් පිට අද මේ කරන මර්ධනය අපි දකිනවනේ. එතකොට සාමාන්‍ය සිවිල් මිනිස්සු මර්ධනය කරන්න පුළුවන් තරමේ පනතක් එයාලා අලුත් විදියකට හදයි. ඒකට නම වෙනස් වෙයි. හැබැයි ජනතාවට දරුණු ප්‍රතිඵල ලැබෙයි. අන්න ඒක තමයි පළවෙනි ප්‍රශ්නේ. ඒක පොඩ්ඩක් highlight කරන්න ඊට පස්සේ මම ඊළඟ එකට යන්න.
Okay, so what his question is, if the government change the PTA, what kind of a rule if will they bring as the next, and what kind of effect that will have for the protesters in the future, and what kind of involvement that the international communities could make for the next for the next step.
So Lakshan, can I just extrapolate a little bit on that? Sorry, so he's a protester on the ground from Sri Lanka, wanted to join the panel. His concern is, by whatever means, if we get rid of the PTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, the government would certainly bring another act to control the ground or the security measures. And how can we, the international community and the UN, prevent an act coming against the activity of the general population, like preventing public movements or a free speech or democratic move? Do we have any answers from any of the panelists?
Yeah, but I would like to just try a shot at that.
Yes, please, go ahead.
My problem is I don't know how far the UN can do. Maybe there could be like pressures on aspects of trade, on various things like that. But I think the ultimate thing is people have to take responsibility for their country. And because we see a cycle of the same faces being rotated into parliament. And the Aragale, one of the calls of the Aragale is that all 225 should go home in parliament. I think there's a lot of justification for that, because I think with the exception of a few people, all we see are well-known, proven failures who keep rotating themselves into parliament, right? so that the people should think differently. We should look at, it's a long-term thing, because unless you have some responsible, shall we say, educated professional types of persons entering parliament, there will always be the parliamentarians who want to protect their interest and oppress the majority, though they are technically only the agents of the people. So as far as the UN and international bodies, okay, there can be sanctions or pressures, but they should not hurt the economy of the country because you hurt the people. But I think we have to take responsibility, and we are responsible. We get the government we deserve. We have voted on the lines of handouts, freebies, political on race, religion, which has to stop, which is what the Aragale was advocating. So that is more fundamental than what the international community can do.
Now, let me also add this. Now, since Jeff has said this, I must also say a word about the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, which had very courageously come forward to protect the rights of the protesters. And we as members are very proud of the Bar Association's contribution to this. But unfortunately, the current regime has been targeting even the current president of the Bar Association, and saying that he is supporting the fascists. Now, this whole narrative of fascism is being used in order to justify the fascist nature of the government itself, to try and cover the illegitimacy of the government and its abuse of the process that is taking place today.
Thank you, Mr. Rajavi. Mr. Tumulla, we can only allow you just one more question because we are running late with our event. Could you just be very concise with your question, please? Thank you.
දැන් ඊළඟට අහන්න තියෙන එක අපි පිළිගන්නවා මේ රටේ එකම තට්ටු මාරු ක්‍රමයක් යන්නේ කියලා. හැබැයි මිනිස්සු වෙනසට බය වෙනවා, බය කරනවා. දැන් මේ යන මර්ධනය දැක්කාමත් අපිට පේනවා. පළවෙනි දේ මට ඇත්තටම දුකයි සිංහල බෞද්ධ කෙනෙක් විදියට. මොකද මම විශ්වාස කරනවා මේ රටේ බහුතරය, අති බහුතරය මේ මර්ධනය කරන විදියට අපිට හැට නොපෙනිච්ච උතුරේ මොන වගේ මර්ධනයක් වුණාද කියන එක දැන් අපිට දැනෙනවා. මේ රටේ සුළු ජන වර්ග වලට මොනතරම් මර්ධනයක් වෙන්නේ නැද්ද, ඒ හැට ආවේ නැත්තේ කොහොමද කියන එක අපිට දැනෙනවා. ඒ නිසා මම ඇත්තටම පුද්ගලයෙක් විදියට දුක් වෙනවා මේ ඒ වෙනුවෙන් මෙච්චර කාලයක් පෙනී නොසිටීම ගැන. හැබැයි ලොකුවට පෙනී සිටින්න බැරි විදිහට කියන. මෙතනින් එහාට අපි ඒ වෙනුවෙන් පෙනී ඉන්නවා. ඒක අරගලයේම කොටසක් කරගන්නවා කියලා අපි විශ්වාස කරනවා. අපි ඉල්ලන්නේ මේ හෙට සමහරලාවට හකිම් මන්ත්‍රීතුමා දන්නවා පෞද්ගලිකව මම දැකලා හම්බෙලා තියෙන හින්දා කිසිදු හේතුවකට සමාජ මාධ්‍ය ජාලාවකවත් පෞද්ගලිකව මගෙන් වැලි ඇටයක හානියක් පොදු දේපලකට කිසිම දෙයකට වෙලා නැහැ. මේ දෙවැනි අවස්ථාව හෙට ICID එකට කැඳවලා තියෙනවා. එක නඩුවක් මේ වෙනකොට කෝට් එකේ යනවා. විදේශ ගමන් තහනමක් දාන්න තියෙනවා. ඔප්පු කරන්න කිසිම සාක්ෂියක් නැතුව නඩු දාන්න. එතකොට අපි කරන්න යන සහ අපිට කරන්න තියෙන කැපැසිටි එක මේකෙන් නවතිනවා. අපි හැමදාම නඩු වලට යනවා, නඩු එක්ක ජීවත් වෙනවා. පොලිසි ගාන යනවා, CID එකට යනවා, CCD එකට යනවා. අපේ කැපැසිටි එක තනිකරම වහලා තියෙන්නේ නඩු වලින්. මේක මම දන්නේ නැහැ මේකට මොනතරම් මැදිහත් වීමක් කරන්න පුළුවන්ද කියලා. හැබැයි අපිට මිනිස්සුන් එක්ක ගනුදෙනු කරන්න වෙලාවක් හදලා දුන්නොත් අපිට පුළුවන් ඊළඟ මැතිවරණයක් වෙලාවෙදි මිනිස්සුගේ මනස් වෙනස් කරන්න සහ අර මෙච්චර කාලයක් ඔලු මාරු ක්‍රමයට යන ක්‍රමේ නවත්තලා අලුත් විදිහේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවක් හදන්න ජනතාව හරි දැනුවත් කරන්න කාලයක් ඕනේ. ඒ කාලෙවත් අපිට දෙන්නේ නැහැ නඩු වලින් අපිව හිර කරලා ගන්න. ඒකට අපිට දෙන්න පුළුවන් සහයෝගය මොන වගේ එකක්ද කියන එක තමයි ඊළඟට අහන්න. මම ස්තුතියි.
Okay, thank you. Lakshani, I will take over on this. Right, so his question is that I'm just trying to kind of recall everything what he says, that this one of the points Mr. Alagaratnam initially made about the burden of proof. All those activists who got into the Aragalaya with peaceful activities has been charged with offenses with no proof. For what that means is that there are court cases, there are hearings, and there are signings which they need to do at the police station. They need to attend those in the middle of their daily requirements of work and other commitments. And what he was requesting or trying to find out is that what could the international community do in terms of bringing a system into place there no arrests or any kind of legal abuses doesn't take place without evidence or proper charges. So this is, again, is one of the core topics we discussed regarding the PTA. And he says that they can influence the future voters towards voting for a proper government if they have access to communicating with the rest of the population. But that doesn't guarantee them safety, because they may be framed with false allegations of propagating terrorism. Is there anything public can do within the framework we have on the ground in Sri Lanka, of course with the international support, where those protesters can carry on, in other words, canvassing? Mr. Hakim, are you able to give an answer to this?
Yeah. Now, incidentally, we have started a mobile campaign 2 days ago from Kankesanture, from KKS, from north, and it will go up to the south and various other cities in order to call for the abolition of the PTA. Interestingly, Jeff mentioned that proper reform of the normal laws would suffice, and then we can totally do away with this piece of legislation and not seek to replace it with another, because that's a very important point. Because the issue about any other replacement, they will always bring this bogey of national security. This national security narrative is being used to bring in repressive legislation such as PTA. Any other act that is come to replace this is also going to continue to have similar features, which will enable the ruling elite to control the system, and also causing serious inefficiencies in our own police department and attorney general department and the rest of the agencies, which are tasked with the primary function of trying to enforce the law, as well as to ensure law and order prevails in the country. So this is very important, so that we must call for the total abolition of the PTA. And together with that, for the time being, it is important, as since the particular Aragali activist is now faced with this problem, there are several hundreds of others who are faced with the same problem now, like the famous actress Damita Aberatna, who had just been released on bail. The amount of trauma and difficulties she had been subjected to under incarceration for a few days she had been inside has been well documented. So this is why we should do away with this piece of legislation, and also insist for the time being that there must be an immediate moratorium on the use of the PTA. And that is where the international community has to be lobbied, that the promise of the government to bring in an immediate moratorium until a replacement is done. So replacement, of course, they have to come to Parliament. In Parliament, I think we have to start mobilizing public opinion, and then pressure the members of Parliament about the misdeeds that have been carried out under the PTA, and to see that no such provisions are reenacted. If possible, not to enact another substitute legislation which will perpetuate the same traumatic experience for the entire Sri Lankans under successive regimes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hakim. On this note, I would like to conclude our panel event. We just got 3 minutes left. Unfortunately, we ran half an hour late on that court. We have caught up with the event. A country which is plagued with misuse of acts, laws, and irregularities with implementation of law, which was again hit hard with the recent economic crisis, which an entire nation, regardless of a variation of political ideas, race, religion, has come together to pull the country forward. this is a time where the country needs as much help as possible from the international community, from the economical and even political support to reform a new way of ruling, and which requires the entire system to be reformed over a period of time. But the least it could do is to work on its obvious defaults, for example, failure in upholding human rights. On that regard, the international community, especially the EU, who is a massive stakeholder in negotiating with the Sri Lankan government, should use its pressures to impose a moratorium or push the government to totally abolish the act, so that the rule of law and the proper rule of democracy can be brought into place. On that note, I would like to thank all three of our panelists, Mr. Dayan Jayatilaka, Mr. Rauf Hakim, and Mr. Jeffrey Alagratnam for your valuable time and your valuable thoughts, enlightening all of us on the topic we discussed. This is a topic we can just run 10, 20 events one after another in addressing various aspects, but it had been really, really insightful. And I hope all of our viewers through Facebook, YouTube, and also Zoom found this event useful. And I also would like to thank the special rapporteurs who have actually taken part observing this event in terms of gathering information to help the country move forward. We all want what's best for the country. We want the country to be united. We want the country to progress in its economic, social, and political trail towards a country which has got a foresight in improving as a nation as a whole, without the previous track record of suppression and abuse of human rights, especially towards the political opponents, the minorities, as well as people with a human rights agenda, such as human rights workers. On that note, I want to thank everybody, including our support team, the interns of the UHRC. There are about 15 working on the background, tried to make this event successful, and also thank the board, UHRC board, in terms of taking the courage to take this topic forward for the betterment of Sri Lanka as a nation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.